I'm calling 911 right now. Diane Crenshaw's scream shattered the Lakeside peace. The HOA Karen stood on my dock, phone raised like a weapon. I'd just refused her insane demand to abandon my family cabin. This is my land, I said calmly. Her laugh was pure venom. Is it? Do you know who I really am in this county? She began dialing, each beep echoing across the water. By tonight, you'll be gone. Something deadly lurked behind her confidence. This woman believed she owned more than just neighborhood authority. What was I missing? And hit like, subscribe if you'd like to help the channel grow. That little thanks button down below means a lot. The confrontation had erupted from what should have been a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. I'd been replacing weathered dock planks when the sound of clicking heels announced unwelcome visitors. Diane Crenshaw marched onto my property like a general inspecting defeated territory, followed by two nervous-looking HOA members clutching clipboards. Their synchronized arrival felt like a coordinated assault. "You're Reed Garrison?" Her voice cut through the afternoon air with surgical precision. No greeting, no introduction, just immediate interrogation. She was a woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed despite the casual lakeside setting, blonde hair pulled back in a style that screamed corporate authority. Her eyes swept over my cabin with undisguised contempt, cataloging every weathered board like evidence in a criminal case. "That's right. And you are..." I set down my hammer, already sensing trouble. The cabin behind me had weathered 70 years of storms and summers, its log construction as solid as the day my grandfather's calloused hands fitted every beam. 3 generations of Garrisons had poured love into this place, turning it from shelter into sanctuary. Diane Crenshaw, president of the Homeowners Association for this entire region. The emphasis on entire region sent warning signals through my brain. Most HOA presidents worried about mailbox colors and holiday decorations. This woman spoke like she controlled territory measured in square miles. "Your property is in severe violation of county development codes." She continued, opening a thick folder with theatrical flair. "This structure represents a significant impediment to our improvement initiatives." County development codes, I'd maintained, every permit filed, every form jumped through, every bureaucratic hoop required. Whatever violations she was claiming existed only in her imagination, or in some shadow authority structure I'd never encountered. "What specific violations?" I asked, though her performance suggested this wasn't about legitimate compliance issues. "Architectural non-compliance, waterfront irregularities, environmental impact violations," she rattled off like reading from a script. "Aesthetic degradation of the regional landscape." She gestured dismissively at my dock repairs. "The list is extensive." Each accusation felt like a calculated blow. My family had maintained this property with meticulous care, preserving its rustic character while meeting every safety requirement. Now this stranger was treating it like a toxic waste site. "I have all required permits for dock maintenance," I said firmly, "filed 3 months ago with the county office." "Oh, Mr. Garrison," her smile dripped condescension, "you don't understand how things actually work. I coordinate directly with all relevant departments. Do you know how extensively I work with the county commissioners?" Something in her tone made me pause. The way she said "work with" instead of "work for," like she was claiming partnership rather than employment. Most county officials I dealt with were careful to specify their exact role and authority. Diane spoke in vague terms that sounded impressive, but revealed nothing concrete. "This cabin has been grandfathered in for decades." I tried reasoning. "My family's ownership predates most development around here." "Grandfathered?" Her laugh sent birds scattering from nearby trees. "We're operating under modern protocols now, not outdated family claims. The county has entrusted me with ensuring this area meets current standards and contributes to our economic goals." There it was again, that passive voice construction. "The county has entrusted me, but who exactly? Which department? What specific authorization?" She spoke like someone accustomed to having her authority accepted without question. "I'm ordering you to vacate by week's end," she said with chilling casualness. We're moving forward with compliance enforcement, and you don't want to be here when that happens. Vacate. This is my property. You can't order me to leave my own land. Can't I? She pulled out her phone with deliberate slowness, savoring each moment of escalating power. You seem confused about county authority and development matters. That's when I realized she was actually going to do it. This wasn't negotiation. It was theater building towards some predetermined climax where she demonstrated her power by summoning law enforcement to my own property. The 911 call unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. "This is Diane Crenshaw, County Development Coordinator," she announced with practiced authority. The title sounded official, but again, no specific department, no badge number, no concrete credentials. Just the impressive-sounding role that could mean anything or nothing. "I need to report a trespassing situation on designated development land. The individual is refusing to vacate property marked for compliance enforcement." My blood turned to ice water. She was speaking to the emergency operator, like someone with legitimate governmental authority, painting me as a criminal squatter rather than a legal property owner. Behind her, the two HOA members shifted uncomfortably clearly, not expecting this nuclear escalation. "Officers should arrive within 15 minutes, she announced, ending the call with visible satisfaction. Fighting county initiatives is a losing battle, one I've won repeatedly in the downtown area and industrial district. The scope was breathtaking. She wasn't describing neighborhood beautification, but some massive scheme spanning the entire county. How many other families had faced this same scenario? As sirens began wailing in the distance, something shifted inside me. The initial anger and confusion crystallized into cold focus. This woman was too confident, too prepared, too sure of herself. She'd done this before. But what if her authority was smoke and mirrors? What if she was counting on people being too intimidated to investigate her claims? My eyes drifted to the small table on my porch, where old county survey maps lay spread in the afternoon sun. My grandfather had left them there, with a weathered box of family documents I'd never examined closely. For 70 years, they'd been just nostalgic paperwork gathering dust. But now, something about those faded boundary lines called to me like a whisper from the past. "You look confused, Mr. Garrison," Diane observed following my gaze. For just a moment, her confident mask slipped, and I caught something that looked suspiciously like fear. "I hope you're not planning to waste everyone's time with outdated paperwork. Development authority supersedes historical family claims." But why was she so quick to dismiss documents she hadn't even examined? The more I stared at those yellowed maps, the more questions multiplied. Those boundary markings seemed to encompass far more territory than just my cabin lot. Territory that might tell a very different story about who actually held authority around here. The sirens grew louder, echoing off the water, as patrol cars approached through the trees. Diane Crenshaw stood on my dock like a conquering general, radiating the kind of absolute confidence that came from winning battles just like this one. But confidence could be performed, authority could be faked, and titles could be self-appointed. As flashing lights began filtering through the forest, one question crystallized with startling clarity: if Diane truly possessed the sweeping governmental powers she claimed, why did those old family maps seem to terrify her more than any law enforcement backup ever could? The police officers who arrived 20 minutes later were professional, thorough, and ultimately useless to Diane's cause. Officer Martinez, a veteran with graying temples, examined my property deed while his younger partner took notes. After 15 minutes of reviewing documentation, they confirmed what I already knew. I was the legal owner of this property, had committed no crimes, and couldn't be forced to leave my own land. "Ma'am, we can't remove someone from their legally owned property based on HOA complaints," Martinez explained to Diane with barely concealed impatience. "If you have legitimate code violations, those need to go through proper county channels." Diane's face flushed crimson, but she maintained her imperious tone. "Officer, I don't think you understand the scope of the situation here. This isn't a simple HOA matter. This involves county-wide development compliance. I'll be filing a comprehensive report with your superiors about the lack of cooperation we've experienced today." Even as the patrol cars disappeared down my driveway, I could see the wheels turning in Diane's head. This setback was temporary, a minor inconvenience in whatever larger plan she was orchestrating. The look she gave me before leaving promised that this was far from over. That promise materialized the next morning in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a summons to an emergency community compliance hearing scheduled for the following evening at the county community center. Not the small Lakeside community building I might have expected, but the large facility downtown that hosted everything from job fairs to political rallies. The formal language was intimidating. All affected county residents are required to attend this hearing regarding compliance enforcement in the Lakeside Development Zone. Failure to appear may result in default compliance actions. The letterhead bore an impressive logo for something called the Regional Development Advisory Council, another official-sounding entity I'd never heard of, despite living here my entire life. By 6 p.m. the next day, the county community center was packed beyond capacity. I arrived early, hoping to gauge the crowd, but found myself swimming upstream against a tide of angry residents flowing toward the main auditorium. These weren't just Lakeside neighbors. I recognized faces from across the county, people from downtown, apartments, suburban developments, even rural farmland areas miles from the lake. Diane had positioned herself at a long table on the auditorium stage, flanked by 3 men in expensive suits who radiated corporate authority. Large display screens showed aerial photographs of the Lakeside area with my cabin highlighted in alarming red. Charts and graphs depicted economic impact analysis and regional development potential, all pointing to my property as a massive obstacle to county prosperity. Ladies and gentlemen, Diane began, her voice amplified by professional sound equipment. We're here tonight to address a critical impediment to our county's economic future. One individual's refusal to comply with established development standards is threatening progress that could benefit every family represented in this room. The presentation that followed was masterfully orchestrated. Diane didn't just attack my property. She painted a picture of economic apocalypse, tourism dollars lost due to aesthetic inconsistencies, property values declining throughout the region, job opportunities vanishing because investors were concerned about regulatory compliance issues in the county. The Lakeside Development Zone represents a $50 million opportunity, she declared, clicking through slides showing gleaming resort complexes and luxury housing developments. But this opportunity requires unified commitment to modern standards. We cannot allow individual selfishness to sabotage collective prosperity. The crowd's response was immediate and visceral. Angry murmurs rippled through the auditorium as hundreds of people absorbed the message that I was personally responsible for their economic struggles. Someone near the back shouted, "Make him comply," and others began echoing the sentiment. But it was Diane's next revelation that truly showcased the scope of her influence. I'm pleased to announce that this compliance initiative has received official support from multiple county departments, she said, gesturing toward her suited companions. Joining me tonight are representatives from County Planning, Economic Development, and Environmental Services. Each man stood and nodded gravely as she introduced them with impressive titles: Deputy Director of Regional Planning, Senior Coordinator for Economic Development Initiatives, and Chief Environmental Compliance Specialist. They looked the part, official, authoritative, and completely convinced that my cabin represented a genuine threat to county welfare. These gentlemen have conducted comprehensive assessments, Diane continued, and their findings are unanimous. The structure in question fails to meet current county standards for waterfront development, environmental impact, and economic contribution to regional growth. As the officials presented their findings, I found myself studying their presentations more carefully. The environmental report claimed my cabin was contributing to shoreline degradation and wildlife habitat disruption, allegations that seemed absurd for a 70-year-old structure that had coexisted peacefully with local ecology for decades. The economic analysis suggested that replacing my cabin with appropriate development could generate hundreds of jobs and millions in tax revenue. Something felt choreographed about their presentations, like they were reading from scripts rather than presenting genuine technical assessments. The environmental specialist in particular kept glancing at Diane for approval, more like a subordinate seeking guidance than an independent expert presenting objective findings. During the break, I overheard fragments of conversations that revealed how extensively Diane had prepared for this moment. Several residents mentioned receiving personal phone calls from her office expressing concern about how my non-compliance might affect their property values. Others had received letters warning that my situation could trigger county-wide reassessments that might increase everyone's taxes. The pressure campaign was comprehensive and personal. Diane hadn't just attacked my property. She'd convinced hundreds of people that my refusal to surrender my land was a direct threat to their financial security. When the hearing resumed, she opened the floor for community input. What followed was a parade of speakers expressing frustration, anger, and fear about how my stubborn refusal to accept progress was hurting their families. A young mother worried about her children's future in a county that couldn't attract quality employers. A retiree feared his property value would plummet if the development initiative failed. A small business owner blamed declining tourism on the county's inability to maintain consistent aesthetic standards. Each speaker had clearly been coached to focus on economic consequences rather than personal attacks. This wasn't a lynch mob. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of community consensus that I was the problem standing between everyone and prosperity. But as the testimonials continued, I began noticing inconsistencies in Diane's narrative. The county officials kept referring to regulations and studies I'd never heard of, citing authorities that seemed to exist only in their presentations. When I tried to ask specific questions about which departments had conducted these assessments, my queries were dismissed as outside the scope of tonight's proceedings. Most telling was an exchange between Diane and an elderly man I recognized as Harold Peterson, a retired county clerk who'd worked in local government for 40 years. Harold stood up near the end of the hearing and asked a simple question. Diane, could you tell us exactly which county ordinance gives your Regional Development Advisory Council enforcement authority over private property? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Diane's confident expression flickered for just a moment before recovering. Harold, I appreciate your interest in procedural details, but tonight's focus is on community impact, not bureaucratic technicalities. The legal framework supporting our initiatives has been thoroughly vetted by appropriate authorities. But Harold wasn't satisfied. I'm asking because in my 40 years with the county, I never encountered a Regional Development Advisory Council. When was this entity established, and under what legal authority does it operate? The auditorium fell silent. Even I could sense that Harold had touched something Diane didn't want examined too closely. Her response was swift and sharp. Mr. Peterson, your decades of service are appreciated, but county governance has evolved significantly since your retirement. Perhaps it would be more productive to focus on solutions rather than questioning established procedures. The dismissal was smooth, but I caught the flash of irritation that crossed her features. Someone with legitimate authority wouldn't need to deflect such basic procedural questions. As the hearing concluded, Diane called for a community vote on whether to support county compliance enforcement regarding my property. The result was overwhelmingly in favor. Nearly 80% of the packed auditorium raised their hands in support of whatever actions were necessary to resolve the impediment I represented. The will of the community is clear, Diane announced with satisfaction. We'll be moving forward with all available enforcement mechanisms. Mr. Garrison has 24 hours to reconsider his position before formal compliance actions begin. Walking out of that auditorium felt like running a gauntlet. Hundreds of my fellow county residents looked at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. These weren't strangers manipulated by propaganda. These were neighbors, people I'd known for years, now convinced that my family's cabin was the primary obstacle to their economic security. But Harold Peterson's questions echoed in my mind as I drove home through the darkness. Regional Development Advisory Council, County Development Coordinator, Environmental Compliance Specialist, all impressive titles attached to official-sounding entities that somehow didn't exist in any county government structure he'd encountered in 4 decades of service. Back at my cabin, I found myself staring at those old survey maps with new intensity. If Diane's authority was as questionable as Harold's questions suggested, then maybe these yellow documents held more significance than nostalgic family memorabilia. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a spark of hope. Diane Crenshaw had built an impressive facade of governmental authority, but facades were exactly that, impressive surfaces concealing whatever lay beneath. And if her power was built on smoke and mirrors, then somewhere in my grandfather's dusty box of documents might be the truth that could bring her whole elaborate deception crashing down. The question was whether I could find that truth before her 24-hour deadline expired, and whatever formal compliance actions she had planned destroyed everything my family had built here. The sleepless night that followed the community hearing transformed my cabin into a war room. I'd spread my grandfather's dusty documents across every available surface, the kitchen table, the couch, even the floor, trying to make sense of 70 years of family paperwork. What had started as desperate curiosity was becoming methodical investigation, driven by Harold Peterson's pointed questions about Diane's mysterious authority. The first breakthrough came at dawn when I discovered my grandfather's correspondence with the State Land Records Office from 1952. The letters revealed a bureaucratic maze I'd never imagined. Apparently, transferring land ownership in the years following World War II required extensive documentation that went far beyond simple property deeds. My grandfather had been meticulous keeping carbon copies of every letter, every form, every official response. But it was a single line in a letter dated March 15, 1952, that made me sit up straight. Please find enclosed the requested verification of the original county land grant documentation as recorded in the state archives under file designation CG 1847, Morrison County 001. County land grant. The phrase sent electricity through my exhausted brain. This wasn't just about property ownership. This was about the fundamental legal framework that established land rights when the county was first formed. I'd stumbled onto something that predated not just Diane's authority, but potentially the entire modern county government structure. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone to call the State Land Records Office. The automated system connected me to a department I'd never known existed: historical land grant research. When a human voice finally answered, I explained that I was researching family property connected to an 1847 Morrison County land grant. "Oh my," said the voice on the other end, a woman who introduced herself as the Senior Historical Research Specialist. Those early county grants are quite rare. Most of them were superseded by later territorial reorganization, but a few remain active under state law. "Could you give me the file designation?" I read her the reference number from my grandfather's letter, listening to the sound of typing on the other end of the line. "Mr. Garrison," she said after a long pause, "this is highly unusual. According to our records, this particular land grant has never been superseded or transferred. It appears to still be active. Could you hold, please, while I consult with our legal department?" Active. The word hung in the air like a revelation. While I waited on hold, I spread out the county survey maps my grandfather had preserved. For the first time, I really studied the boundary lines he'd carefully marked in faded red ink. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The boundaries didn't just encompass my cabin lot, they stretched across miles of territory, including the Lakeside community, the downtown business district, and vast stretches of what was now considered public county land. If these maps were accurate, my family's original land grant covered an area that dwarfed anything I'd imagined possible. "Mr. Garrison," the specialist's voice returned, tinged with excitement, "I'm going to need you to come in person to view these documents. What you're describing appears to be one of the original founding grants that established Morrison County. Our legal team has some questions about current ownership status that can only be resolved with the complete historical record. The 2-hour drive to the state capitol gave me time to process what I was uncovering. Diane's aggressive confidence suddenly made more sense. If she somehow knew about questionable land ownership issues, she might have built her entire authority structure around exploiting legal gray areas. But what if the gray areas weren't gray at all? What if there was clear documented ownership that she was desperately trying to obscure? The State Archives building was an imposing granite structure that radiated governmental authority. The specialist met me in the lobby, a petite woman in her 40s with the intense focus of someone who lived and breathed historical documentation. She led me through security checkpoints and down corridors lined with filing cabinets that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Mr. Garrison," she said as we walked, "I've been with this department for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like your family's documentation. Most land grants from that era were either superseded, subdivided, or reverted to territorial authority when counties reorganized. But this one seems to have slipped through every bureaucratic crack for over a century and a half." The conference room she led me to contained a long table covered with carefully preserved documents. Some so old the ink had faded to brown, others bearing official seals that looked like they belonged in a museum. At the head of the table sat a distinguished man in his 60s who introduced himself as the chief legal historian for the State Archives. "Mr. Garrison," the legal historian began, his voice carrying the weight of academic authority. "Your grandfather's correspondence led us to conduct a comprehensive review of Morrison County's founding documentation. What we've discovered is unprecedented." He lifted a leather-bound folder with hands that treated it like sacred text. "This is the original state land grant issued to your ancestor Thomas Garrison on September 12, 1847. At that time, the territorial government was actively seeking individuals willing to establish and develop new county structures in unsettled regions." The document he showed me was breathtaking, hand-lettered, in elegant script bearing multiple official seals and mapping out boundaries that covered enormous territory. But it was the specific language that made my heart race. "Thomas Garrison is hereby granted perpetual ownership and administrative authority over all lands within the designated county boundaries to be held in trust for county development and governance." What exactly does that mean in modern legal terms? I asked, struggling to comprehend the implications. The legal historian exchanged glances with the research specialist before delivering the bombshell. "It means, Mr. Garrison, that your family legally owns every piece of land within the original Morrison County boundaries. When the county was incorporated in 1847, the territorial government essentially granted your ancestor ownership of the entire area in exchange for establishing infrastructure and governance. Over time, your family has operated like landlords who've allowed tenants to build and develop while retaining underlying ownership rights." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what they were telling me. Diane Crenshaw wasn't just overstepping her authority with my cabin. She was attempting to exercise control over land that my family legally owned. Every county ordinance, every development initiative, every exercise of governmental power was technically happening on my property. "There's more," the specialist said quietly, producing another folder. "We found correspondence from the 1920s where your great-grandfather explicitly reserved all administrative oversight rights while allowing county operations to continue. He was essentially permitting the county government to function while maintaining ultimate legal authority." The implications crystallized with devastating clarity. If these documents were authentic and legally binding, then Diane's entire power structure was built on fraud. Her Regional Development Advisory Council, her County Development Coordinator title, her authority to order compliance enforcement, none of it meant anything. If she was trying to control land, she had no legal right to touch. So, if someone were claiming governmental authority over my property without legal basis, I began, they would be committing fraud, the legal historian finished, particularly if they were using fake titles or non-existent entities to exercise that authority. I thought about Diane's impressive presentations, her official-looking documentation, her confident claims about county support. Everything she'd done was not just fraudulent. It was criminal activity conducted on my own land. I need copies of all of this, I said, gesturing at the documents covering the table. Official copies that will stand up in court. Already prepared, the specialist said, handing me a thick folder bearing multiple official seals. But, Mr. Garrison, if someone has been operating a fraudulent authority structure on your land and convinced county officials to support their actions, then you're dealing with a conspiracy that could involve multiple levels of county government. As I drove back toward Morrison County with documentation that could expose everything, my shock transformed into cold determination. Diane had given me 24 hours to reconsider my position, but she'd made a fatal miscalculation. She'd threatened the wrong person on the wrong piece of land. Tomorrow's confrontation wouldn't be about defending my cabin anymore. It would be about reclaiming an entire county that had never stopped being mine in the first place. And this time, I'd have the legal ammunition to destroy her fraudulent empire once and for all. The morning of the final deadline arrived with all the subtlety of an execution. I'd spent the night rehearsing my presentation, organizing the state archive documents into a logical sequence that would systematically demolish Diane's fraudulent authority. But when I arrived at the county community center at 9 a.m., I realized I'd underestimated the scope of her final offensive. The parking lot was packed beyond anything I'd seen before. News vans from 3 neighboring counties lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like weapons. A hastily erected banner across the building's entrance read, "County Emergency Session, Final Resolution," in letters large enough to be seen from space. This wasn't just a community meeting anymore. Diane had transformed it into a media circus designed to crush any opposition through sheer public pressure. Inside the auditorium had been reconfigured with a formal hearing setup that looked more like a courtroom than a community gathering. Diane sat at an elevated judicial bench, flanked by 5 men in expensive suits each, with nameplates identifying them as various county officials. Behind them, a massive projection screen displayed an architectural rendering of a gleaming resort complex where my cabin currently stood, complete with marina golf course and luxury condominiums. The audience had swollen to include what appeared to be every business owner, property developer, and political figure within 50 miles. I recognized the mayor from the county seat, several city council members, and at least 2 state legislators. Diane hadn't just gathered angry neighbors. She'd assembled a coalition of economic and political power that represented millions of dollars in potential investment capital. Ladies and gentlemen, Diane began, her voice amplified by a professional sound system that made every word echo with authority. Today we resolve the final obstacle to the most significant economic opportunity in our county's history. The Morrison County Lakefront Initiative represents a $300 million investment that will create over 1,500 permanent jobs and transform our region into a premier destination. The presentation that followed was devastating in its comprehensiveness. Architectural firms had created detailed plans for the entire lakefront area. Economic consultants had prepared impact studies showing massive tax revenue increases. Environmental specialists had somehow concluded that removing my deteriorating structure would actually improve water quality and wildlife habitat. But it was the parade of official endorsements that truly showcased the scope of her preparation. One by one, the suited officials stood to deliver carefully rehearsed testimonies. The planning director confirmed preliminary approval from all relevant departments. The environmental officer testified about documented threats to shoreline stability. The economic coordinator presented projections showing millions in lost revenue if my continued non-compliance blocked the initiative. Each speaker referenced studies I'd never seen, cited regulations that sounded legitimate, and painted my resistance as an existential threat to county welfare. "Mr. Garrison," Diane said, turning to address me directly for the first time, "you've had ample opportunity to resolve this situation voluntarily. The county has been more than patient with your emotional attachment to this property. But individual sentiment cannot be allowed to sabotage collective prosperity. And the way she said emotional attachment dripped with condescension, reducing 3 generations of family history to irrational nostalgia that sensible people would set aside for the greater good. The audience murmured agreement, and I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes judging me as the selfish obstacle standing between them and economic salvation. However, Diane continued with theatrical magnanimity, the county recognizes that this situation has been difficult for you personally. Therefore, we're prepared to offer one final resolution that acknowledges your family's historical connection to the area. She nodded to one of her suited companions, who produced an official-looking document. The county is prepared to offer you fair market value compensation, $250,000, along with guaranteed first consideration for employment opportunities within the new facility. This represents our final offer for voluntary resolution, $250,000. The figure hung in the air like a golden carrot, and I could hear approving murmurs from the audience. To most people, it probably seemed like generous compensation for a rustic cabin on a small lot. They had no idea they were offering to buy a county from its rightful owner for pocket change. I need to state clearly, I said, standing up in the middle of the packed auditorium, that I have documents proving this entire proceeding is based on fraudulent authority. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Diane's expression shifted to something resembling pity mixed with irritation. Mr. Garrison, we understand that losing family property is emotionally difficult, but accusations of fraud are both inappropriate and potentially actionable. The county's authority in this matter has been thoroughly established through proper legal channels. No, it hasn't, I insisted, pulling the state archive folder from my briefcase. I have documentation from the State Historical Research Department proving that Mr. Garrison, the planning director, interrupted sharply. This hearing is not the appropriate venue for rehashing property deed disputes that have already been resolved through proper county assessment procedures. Your claims about historical documents have been reviewed and found to be without merit for current governance purposes. Reviewed by whom, when I'd never submitted any historical documents to county review, but his confident dismissal made it sound like my evidence had already been considered and rejected by appropriate authorities. The audience was nodding along, accepting his assertion that my documentation was irrelevant bureaucratic noise. Furthermore, Diane added, her voice taking on a stern tone, continued disruption of official county proceedings could result in contempt charges. Mr. Garrison, you have exactly 60 seconds to either accept the county's generous offer or face immediate eminent domain action. 60 seconds. The ultimatum crashed over me like a physical blow. Everything I'd discovered at the state archives, the proof of my family's ownership, the documentation of Diane's fraud, the evidence that could expose her entire scheme, was being dismissed as irrelevant paperwork that had no bearing on official county proceedings. Looking around the packed auditorium, I took in hundreds of faces that ranged from impatient to actively hostile. These weren't just strangers manipulated by propaganda. These were neighbors, business owners, civic leaders, and elected officials who genuinely believed that my stubborn refusal to accept reality was blocking legitimate economic advancement. Even Meredith Thompson, the elderly neighbor who had once whispered encouragement about my family's historical presence, sat silently in the third row, with her eyes cast downward, unwilling to publicly associate herself with someone who'd been painted as an enemy of community welfare. 30 seconds, Mr. Garrison, Diane announced, glancing at her watch with theatrical precision. The county has been extraordinarily patient, but that patience has limits. In that moment of absolute isolation, surrounded by hundreds of people who wanted me gone, something crystallized in my mind. Diane's entire performance was too perfect, too orchestrated, too dependent on preventing any real examination of her authority. She'd built an impressive theater of governmental power, but theater was exactly what it was, a carefully constructed illusion designed to prevent anyone from looking behind the curtain. Time's up, Diane announced with finality. The county commissioners will now vote on Resolution 47 authorization for emergency eminent domain action regarding the property known as Lot 15 Lakeside Zone. One by one, the 5 officials at the elevated table voted in favor of the resolution. Each yes vote was recorded by the stenographer and acknowledged by scattered applause from the audience. When the final vote was cast, Diane stood with visible satisfaction. Resolution 47 passes unanimously. Mr. Garrison, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises before county enforcement action begins. The Sheriff's Department has been instructed to assist with removal of any personal property and to prevent interference with activities. As I walked out of that auditorium, the weight of defeat should have crushed me. Behind me, I could hear excited conversations about construction timelines and job opportunities. The community was already celebrating their victory over the selfish man who'd tried to stand in the way of their golden future. But instead of despair, I felt cold clarity settling over me like armor. Diane had just made a fatal tactical error. By forcing this public confrontation, by assembling every power player in the county, by making her fraudulent authority the centerpiece of a media spectacle, she'd given me the perfect stage for what was coming next. She wanted a final showdown. She was about to get one. But tomorrow's confrontation wouldn't be about defending my cabin anymore. It would be about exposing the fact that everything she just orchestrated was a criminal conspiracy conducted on land that had never stopped being mine. And this time, I wouldn't be asking permission to present my evidence. The 24 hours Diane had given me to vacate became the most intense research session of my life. Instead of packing, I transformed my cabin into a strategic command center, spreading state archive documents across every surface, while cross-referencing county records I'd been accumulating for days. The contrast was stark. Diane's elaborate theatrical presentation versus my dusty historical paperwork. But I was beginning to understand that sometimes the most powerful weapons were the ones nobody expected. The first call I made was back to the State Historical Research Department. When the senior specialist answered, I could hear the excitement in her voice. Mr. Garrison, perfect timing. After our meeting yesterday, we've been conducting additional research into Morrison County's founding documentation. What we've discovered is, well, it's unprecedented. What do you mean? I asked, though part of me already knew this was going to change everything. We've been in contact with the State Attorney General's office, she continued. Your county situation has triggered a formal review of territorial land grants across multiple counties. It appears Morrison County isn't the only place where original ownership rights may have been overlooked over the decades. The implication sent electricity through my exhausted brain. This wasn't just about my family's property anymore. It was about a systematic pattern that might extend throughout the region. If state officials were already investigating similar situations, then my documentation wasn't just family memorabilia, it was evidence in a potential criminal case. There's more, she said. We've been trying to verify the credentials of the county officials who testified at yesterday's hearing. The planning director, environmental officer, economic coordinator. We can't find any of them listed in the official state directory of certified county personnel. My blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means either they're using fake titles or they're legitimate employees who've been instructed to exceed their actual scope. Either way, what happened yesterday was not a legal governmental proceeding. The phrases hammered home what I'd suspected, but hadn't dared to believe. Diane hadn't just bent the rules or exploited bureaucratic gray areas. She'd created an entirely fictitious structure and convinced hundreds of people it was real. We need you to come back to the Capitol immediately, the specialist continued. The Attorney General wants to review your documentation as part of a formal investigation. And Mr. Garrison, bring everything. Every document, every map, every piece of correspondence your family preserved. This is much bigger than anyone realized. The 3-hour drive to the state capitol gave me time to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. Diane's 24-hour deadline suddenly seemed laughably irrelevant. While she was preparing to celebrate her victory, Over a stubborn property owner, state law enforcement was building a case that could destroy her entire operation. The state attorney general's office occupied an entire floor of the capital's main government building. When I arrived, I was immediately escorted to a conference room where 3 people waited: the historical research specialist, a stern-looking woman introduced as the chief investigator for governmental fraud, and a distinguished man in his 60s who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Mr. Garrison," the Attorney General began, gesturing for me to take a seat at the polished conference table. "What you've brought to our attention has triggered the largest investigation into local governmental fraud in state history. Morrison County appears to be the epicenter of a scheme that's been operating across multiple jurisdictions for several years. We've found evidence of questionable land seizures, dubious development approvals, and manufactured entities in at least 4 neighboring counties. The pattern is remarkably consistent: create impressive-sounding titles, intimidate property owners with threats of legal action, and pressure communities into supporting large-scale development projects on land that was never legally available for those purposes." The scope was breathtaking. Diane wasn't just a local con artist. She was apparently part of an organized operation that had been systematically defrauding property owners across the entire region. My family's cabin had just been the latest target in a scheme that had been running successfully for years. "But your situation is unique," the historical specialist interjected, spreading out copies of my family's documents. "Most of the other cases involved disputed ownership or bureaucratic confusion. Your family's land grant is different. It's ironclad, continuous, and legally unassailable. You don't just own your cabin, Mr. Garrison. According to state law, you own the entire county." The Attorney General leaned forward intently. "Which means everything Diane Crenshaw has done, every fake entity she's created, every fraudulent proceeding she's conducted, every illegal seizure she's orchestrated, has happened on your property without your permission. She's not just committed crimes against you, she's committed them against every resident of Morrison County while trespassing on your land." The legal terminology was complex, but the implications were crystal clear. I wasn't just a victim of Diane's scheme. I was the key to unraveling the entire operation. My ownership rights provided the legal foundation for challenging not just her actions, but every decision she'd made throughout the county. "What we need from you," the investigator said, "is authorization to act on your behalf in reclaiming your property and exposing this criminal organization. But I have to warn you, once we begin this process, there's no going back. This will become a very public case." I thought about the packed auditorium from yesterday, the hundreds of neighbors who had been convinced I was the obstacle to their prosperity, the officials who had voted to steal my property on camera. The prospect of public vindication was appealing, but something else mattered more. "What happens to all the people who've been victims of this scheme?" I asked. "The families who've lost property, the communities that have been manipulated. That's the remarkable thing about your situation," the Attorney General replied with the first smile I'd seen from him. "Because you own the underlying land throughout Morrison County, you have the legal power to void any fraudulent transfers or seizures that occurred without your permission. Essentially, you can undo years of illegal activity and restore legitimate property rights." The power he was describing was almost overwhelming. Not just the ability to stop Diane's operation, but to repair the damage she'd already done to countless other families. The responsibility felt massive, but so did the opportunity for justice. "There's one more thing," the historical specialist said quietly. "We've been monitoring communications from Morrison County since yesterday's hearing. Diane Crenshaw has scheduled what she's calling a victory celebration and groundbreaking ceremony for tomorrow afternoon. She's invited media, investors, state legislators, and hundreds of community members to witness the official launch of her development project. She's planning to demolish your cabin tomorrow as the symbolic beginning of construction," the investigator added. "It's going to be a major media event designed to showcase her success and attract additional investment for similar projects in other counties." The audacity was staggering. While I was uncovering the truth about her criminal operation, Diane was planning a public celebration of her victory. She was so confident in her manufactured power that she was willing to commit property destruction in front of cameras and witnesses. Which gives us a remarkable opportunity, the Attorney General said, his expression turning shrewd. Instead of simply filing charges and letting this case work through the courts, over months or years, we can expose her operation in real time in front of all the same people she's been deceiving. The plan he outlined was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to stop tomorrow's event, we would let it proceed exactly as Diane had planned. But when she raised the ceremonial sledgehammer to demolish my cabin, I would step forward with state law enforcement backing and present the documentation proving that she was about to commit criminal destruction of property on land she had no legal right to touch. The media will already be there, the investigator explained. The investors will be watching. The community leaders who've been supporting her will be witnessing everything. When we expose her operation, it won't be a bureaucratic legal proceeding. It will be a public revelation that destroys her credibility instantly. And more importantly, the Attorney General added, it will demonstrate to every other community dealing with similar schemes that these false entities can be challenged and defeated. Your case could prevent hundreds of other families from losing their property. As I drove back toward Morrison County that evening, armed with official documentation and state law enforcement backing, I felt a profound sense of calm settling over me. Tomorrow's confrontation would unfold with the quiet inevitability of sunrise. Diane had built her empire on the assumption that no one would ever possess both the evidence and the authority to challenge her. She was about to learn that assumptions like theatrical presentations could be shattered by something as simple as the truth presented at exactly the right moment. The morning of Diane's victory celebration dawned with the crisp clarity of autumn perfection. From my cabin's porch, I could see the activity across the lake as crews erected a massive white tent, positioned camera equipment, and hung banners proclaiming Morrison County's bright future begins today. The irony wasn't lost on me. Diane had chosen the most beautiful possible day to publicly destroy herself. By 10 a.m., the Lakeside area had transformed into something resembling a political rally, crossed with a corporate product launch. News vans from major networks had joined the local media, their satellite dishes creating a small forest of technology pointed skyward. A red carpet led from the parking area to an elevated platform where microphones and speakers had been arranged for maximum dramatic impact. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my grandfather's funeral 5 years earlier. If today was going to be theater, I wanted to look the part of someone who belonged in this arena of power and influence. The state archive documents were organized in a leather briefcase, each piece of evidence arranged in the sequence the Attorney General's team had recommended for maximum impact. At exactly 11:30, the first wave of VIPs began arriving. State legislators stepped out of black sedans, followed by business leaders in expensive cars. Then a parade of local officials and community leaders who had apparently decided this was an event they couldn't miss. The guest list had expanded far beyond yesterday's hearing. This was now a regional showcase designed to attract attention from across multiple counties. Diane emerged from a limousine at exactly noon, dressed in what could only be described as a power suit, designed for maximum television impact. She worked the crowd like a seasoned politician, shaking hands, posing for photos, and radiating the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem she couldn't solve through sheer force of personality and manufactured authority. The ceremony began with a presentation that made yesterday's hearing look modest by comparison. Multiple screens displayed architectural renderings, economic projections, and artists' conceptions of Morrison County's transformed future. The resort complex planned for my cabin's location was just the beginning. Diane had apparently been designing a complete economic makeover that would touch every corner of the county. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice amplified across the water by professional sound equipment. "Today marks the beginning of the most ambitious economic transformation in our region's history. The Morrison County Renaissance Project will create over 3,000 jobs, generate hundreds of millions in revenue, and establish our community as a destination for visitors and investors from around the world. The applause was thunderous. Hundreds of people cheered for a vision that promised to lift everyone's fortunes through coordinated development and strategic investment. Cameras captured beaming faces, enthusiastic gestures, the collective euphoria of a community convinced it was about to become wealthy. But it was the parade of endorsements that truly showcased the scope of Diane's preparation. The regional planning coordinator praised the environmental assessments, while the economic development specialist described job creation potential. Each speaker was introduced with elaborate credentials and spoke with practiced authority, referencing comprehensive studies and regulatory approvals that painted my former resistance as an unfortunate obstacle finally overcome. Today's groundbreaking represents our community's commitment to progress over sentiment, collective prosperity over individual stubbornness, declared the Deputy Director of Regional Development. The crowd's energy shifted from celebration to something more aggressive. These weren't just empty buzzwords, but fighting words directed at anyone who might question surrendering individual rights for economic advancement. As the presentations continued, I studied the officials more carefully. The regional planning coordinator kept glancing at Diane for approval before making substantive statements. The economic development specialist deflected technical inquiries with vague assurances about thorough review processes without citing specific regulations. Most telling was their interaction with legitimate officials. When the actual county sheriff asked about security coordination, the fake officials exchanged nervous glances before Diane smoothly redirected conversation to economic benefits. "And now," Diane announced with theatrical flourish, "the moment we've all been waiting for, the symbolic removal of the final obstacle to Morrison County's bright future." She gestured toward my cabin, surrounded by orange cones and yellow tape like a crime scene. A construction crew stood ready with sledgehammers and crowbars, their equipment gleaming in the afternoon sun. Cameras focused on the modest log structure that had somehow become the symbol of everything standing between this community and economic salvation. "This structure represents more than outdated architecture," Diane continued, her voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor addressing a jury. "It represents the kind of thinking that keeps communities trapped in the past, while opportunities for growth and prosperity slip away to more forward-thinking regions." The crowd's mood had evolved from celebration to righteous indignation. People nodded approvingly as she lifted a ceremonial sledgehammer, its handle decorated with ribbons and county colors. This was her moment of triumph, the symbolic destruction of individual resistance in favor of collective advancement. "Before we begin construction of our bright future," she said, raising the sledgehammer high above her head, "let us remove the last remnant of obstinate attachment to stop." My voice carried clearly across the water, amplified by the same sound system Diane had been using. The single word cut through her speech like a blade through silk. Every head turned toward the lake where I stood on my dock, briefcase in hand, wearing the kind of suit that suggested I belonged in rooms where important decisions were made. The visual contrast was striking. Diane stood elevated on her theatrical platform, surrounded by banners and screens and the elaborate machinery of manufactured spectacle. I stood alone on weathered wooden planks, holding nothing but a leather briefcase and the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what that briefcase contained. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, walking slowly toward the gathered crowd, "before any construction begins, there's something you need to know about the land you're standing on." Diane's expression shifted from triumph to confusion to something that might have been fear. The crowd's energy, which had been building toward cathartic release, suddenly stalled like a car hitting an unexpected wall. "Mr. Garrison, this proceeding is closed. You had your opportunity to participate in the legal process, and that time has passed." "Actually," I replied, continuing my steady approach toward the platform, "I think you'll find that the legal process is just beginning." I opened my briefcase and withdrew the leather-bound folder containing my family's state-authenticated documents. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, designed to draw attention to the official seals and aged parchment that contrasted sharply with Diane's glossy presentation materials. I have here documentation from the State Attorney General's office proving that every action taken in this county over the past several months has been conducted without legal authority. The crowd's confident energy began draining away like air from a punctured balloon. Business leaders exchanged uncertain glances. Politicians calculated potential liability. Media representatives sensed a story taking an unexpected turn. Diane attempted to maintain control, but her voice carried a slight tremor. "Mr. Garrison, these proceedings have been thoroughly vetted by appropriate authorities. Your personal grievances cannot be allowed to disrupt grievances." I interrupted, holding up the original 1847 land grant with its multiple official state seals clearly visible. "This isn't about grievances. This is about ownership." Silence spread across the gathering like spilled water. The cameras that had been focused on Diane's ceremonial sledgehammer swiveled toward me and the historical document I was displaying. Even the construction crew stopped their preparations, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the carefully orchestrated proceedings. "What you're looking at," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the professional sound system, "is the original state land grant that established Morrison County. It was issued to my ancestor Thomas Garrison on September 12, 1847, granting him perpetual ownership of all lands within the county boundaries." The implications hit different sections of the crowd at different speeds. The business leaders grasped it first, their faces shifting from confusion to alarm as they calculated legal ramifications. Politicians began looking for exits, recognizing political disaster when it stared them in the face. Community members simply looked bewildered, struggling to process how their celebration had suddenly become a legal minefield. Which means I continued approaching the platform where Diane stood frozen with her sledgehammer raised, "that every person standing here today is standing on my property. Every official who testified about regulatory compliance has been exercising authority over land they have no legal right to control. And every decision made about development in Morrison County has been made without the permission of the actual owner." Diane's face went pale. The theatrical confidence that had carried her through months of manufactured authority crumbled in real time. That's impossible. These are certified county officials with proper credentials, and no." I said firmly, producing additional documents from my briefcase. "They're not. Investigations conducted by the State Attorney General's office have revealed that several of the officials who testified about this project do not exist in any legitimate governmental capacity." The crowd wasn't murmuring anymore. They were dead silent, absorbing the magnitude of what I was claiming. If I was right, then everything they'd been told about legal authority, proper procedures, and regulatory approval was an elaborate lie. The economic opportunity they'd been celebrating was built on criminal fraud conducted on someone else's property. I gestured toward the construction area where my cabin stood ready for demolition. "So, before anyone takes a sledgehammer to my property, perhaps we should have a real legal review of who has the authority to authorize construction on land that's been owned by the same family for over 170 years. Diane stood on her platform, sledgehammer still raised, but no longer looking like a symbol of progress. Instead, she looked like someone who had been caught in the middle of committing a very public crime, surrounded by witnesses and cameras that had originally been invited to document her triumph. The question hanging over the entire gathering was simple. Did I actually own Morrison County, or was this the desperate gambit of a man who'd already lost everything? The silence that followed my question stretched for what felt like an eternity. Hundreds of people stood frozen in a tableau of confusion and growing alarm while cameras continued rolling, and Diane remained motionless on her platform, ceremonial sledgehammer still raised like a weapon she no longer knew how to use. Then, cutting through the tension like a knife, came the sound of approaching sirens. Not the single patrol car that might respond to a disturbance, but multiple vehicles moving with the coordinated precision of a planned operation. The crowd began turning nervously toward the access road as a convoy of state law enforcement vehicles appeared through the trees. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'd like you to meet some people who can verify everything I've just told you." 3 black SUVs and 2 state police cars pulled up to the event area with practiced efficiency. The first person to emerge was the Attorney General himself, flanked by investigators from his office, and armed with briefcases that matched mine in both appearance and apparent importance. Behind them came uniformed state troopers who positioned themselves strategically around the gathering, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of people who expected to be obeyed without question. The crowd's confusion transformed into something approaching panic. Business leaders began edging toward their vehicles while politicians pulled out phones to make urgent calls. The media representatives, however, moved closer. They could smell a story that was about to become much bigger than a local development dispute. "Good afternoon," the Attorney General announced, his voice requiring no amplification to command attention. "I'm here to provide official verification of the documents Mr. Garrison has presented, and to explain the legal implications of what you've all witnessed here today." Diane finally lowered her sledgehammer, but her face had taken on the pale, sweaty appearance of someone realizing that months of careful planning were about to collapse in spectacular fashion. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said, her voice no longer carrying its previous authority. "The county has thoroughly reviewed all relevant documentation, and these proceedings have been conducted according to proper legal protocols." "Actually, they haven't," the Attorney General replied with the calm precision of someone stating facts rather than opinions. "Our investigation has revealed that Morrison County has been operating under fraudulent authority for several months, possibly years. The entities claiming governmental power over land development in this county do not exist in any legitimate legal capacity." He gestured toward the officials who had been providing testimonials about the project. The Regional Planning Coordinator, Economic Development Specialist, and Infrastructure Compliance Director, who testified today, are not employed by Morrison County or any other legitimate governmental body. They are private individuals who have been impersonating county officials while exercising authority they do not legally possess. The impact on the crowd was immediate and devastating. People who had been enthusiastically supporting what they believed was legitimate economic development suddenly realized they'd been participants in an elaborate criminal conspiracy. The business leaders who had been calculating profit margins were now calculating legal exposure. The politicians who had been positioning themselves for credit were now looking for ways to distance themselves from potential criminal liability. But it was the fake officials themselves who provided the most dramatic reaction. The Regional Planning Coordinator bolted toward the parking area, pushing through the crowd with the desperate energy of someone who knew exactly how much trouble he was in. The Economic Development Specialist tried a different approach, stepping forward with his hands raised in what appeared to be an attempt at explanation or surrender. "Wait, wait," he called out, his previous authoritative demeanor completely abandoned. "There's been a misunderstanding about our roles here. We were hired as consultants to provide expertise, not to impersonate government officials. Ms. Crenshaw told us this was all properly authorized through legitimate channels." Diane's face went from pale to crimson. "That's completely false. These men are certified county personnel who have been working within established protocols. Any suggestion otherwise is a desperate attempt to undermine legitimate governmental processes." But her protests were starting to sound increasingly desperate, especially as the Infrastructure Compliance Director chose that moment to make his own break for the parking area. The sight of her own officials fleeing the scene like criminals was not helping her case for legitimate authority. Furthermore, the Attorney General continued producing his own set of documents. "Our investigation has revealed that the Regional Development Advisory Council, which has been claiming authority over county land use decisions, was never legally established. It exists only as a private entity created by Ms. Crenshaw and her associates for the purpose of intimidating property owners and facilitating fraudulent land transfers." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Everything they'd been told about proper governmental oversight, regulatory compliance, and legal authority was not just wrong, it was criminally fraudulent. They'd been supporting what they believed was legitimate economic development, but they'd actually been witnessing an elaborate real estate scam. The so-called county ordinances cited in these proceedings, the Attorney General continued, do not exist in any official legal code. The environmental assessments referenced by the fake officials were never conducted by legitimate agencies. The economic impact studies presented as the basis for eminent domain action were created by private consulting firms with no governmental authority whatsoever. Diane's second meltdown was far more spectacular than her first. Where her earlier loss of composure had been limited to raised voices and flustered explanations, this breakdown was complete and public. This is ridiculous. I've worked with county commissioners, planning departments, and economic development offices throughout the region. I have documentation proving my authority to coordinate these initiatives. No, the Attorney General said firmly, you don't. Our investigation has revealed that you've been impersonating a county official, creating fraudulent entities, and exercising authority you do not possess. Every action you've taken regarding land development in Morrison County has been criminal in nature. That's when Diane made her fatal mistake. Instead of trying to maintain her dignity or seek legal counsel, she launched into a desperate attempt to justify her actions by revealing the scope of her operation. You don't understand the complexity of coordinating development across multiple counties. The Regional Development Advisory Council represents millions of dollars in investment and hundreds of jobs. These initiatives have been years in the planning, involving legitimate business interests and economic development goals. The admission was devastating. In trying to defend herself, she'd just confessed to operating the fraudulent scheme across multiple counties. Exactly what the Attorney General's office had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove until this moment. Ms. Crenshaw, one of the state investigators said, stepping forward with handcuffs clearly visible, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, impersonating a government official, and criminal trespass. You have the right to remain silent. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the woman who had dominated their county's political landscape for months was handcuffed in front of cameras and hundreds of witnesses. The ceremonial sledgehammer lay abandoned on the platform, a symbol of power that had turned into evidence in a criminal case. But the most dramatic moment came when the Attorney General turned to address the crowd directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be absolutely clear about the legal situation you're facing. Every person who participated in yesterday's hearing that voted to seize Mr. Garrison's property did so based on fraudulent information provided by criminals. Every business leader who invested in this development project has been the victim of an elaborate real estate scam. Every community member who supported these initiatives was manipulated through lies and manufactured authority. The psychological impact was overwhelming. People who had spent months believing they were participating in legitimate economic development suddenly realized they'd been pawns in a criminal conspiracy. The community members who had turned against me, the business leaders who had invested money, the political figures who had lent their support, all of them had been systematically deceived. However, the Attorney General continued, Mr. Garrison's ownership of Morrison County creates an opportunity to resolve this situation in a way that protects the legitimate interests of county residents. Because he holds legal title to the land that was fraudulently developed, he has the authority to void illegal transfers and restore proper ownership to families who lost property through this scheme. The implications began sinking in. I wasn't just the victim who had exposed the fraud. I was the legal authority who could undo the damage it had caused. Every family that had been pressured into selling property, every business that had been forced to relocate, every community organization that had lost access to facilities, all of it could potentially be restored through my ownership rights. Meredith Thompson, the elderly neighbor who had been too frightened to support me, publicly stepped forward from the crowd. Her face showed a mixture of shame and relief as she approached where I stood. Reed, I owe you an apology. We all do. I knew something felt wrong about the way they were pressuring everyone, but I was too scared to speak up. Her public acknowledgement seemed to break a dam of suppressed guilt and fear. One by one, other community members began approaching. not with the hostility they'd shown during Diane's orchestrated hearings, but with the shame of people who realized they'd been manipulated into supporting something fundamentally wrong. "Mr. Garrison," said a man I recognized as owner of the Lakeside Marina, "I supported the development project because I was told it would bring business to the area. I never realized we were being lied to about the legal situation. What happens to those of us who made investments based on fraudulent information?" The Attorney General fielded the question with practiced professionalism. "Our office will be working with Mr. Garrison to establish a process for addressing financial losses caused by this criminal conspiracy. Because the fraud was perpetrated on his property, he has significant discretion in determining how to remedy the damage done to legitimate property owners and business operators." As Diane was led away in handcuffs, her empire of manufactured authority collapsing in real time, I found myself facing a responsibility I'd never anticipated. It wasn't enough to expose the fraud or reclaim my property. I now held the power to determine the future of an entire county that had been victimized by the same criminals who had tried to steal my cabin. The crowd that had gathered to celebrate my eviction was now looking to me for guidance on how to rebuild their community on a foundation of legitimate legal authority rather than elaborate criminal deception. The ceremonial sledgehammer that was supposed to demolish my home had instead demolished the fraudulent power structure that had been oppressing the entire county. But as I stood surrounded by cameras, state officials, and hundreds of neighbors who were finally learning the truth about their situation, one thing was absolutely clear. The real work of restoring Morrison County was just beginning. 3 months after Diane Crenshaw's arrest, I stood on the same dock where this entire ordeal had begun, watching the sunrise paint Morrison County in colors that somehow seemed brighter than they had in years. The lake was peaceful, the air was clean, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I was truly home. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of Diane's exposure, Morrison County had descended into something resembling controlled chaos. Property ownership disputes required resolution, fraudulent contracts needed to be voided, and an entire community needed to rebuild trust in the very concept of legitimate governance. The weight of that responsibility had settled on my shoulders like a mantle I'd never asked to wear. But with the guidance of the Attorney General's office and a team of legal experts who specialized in territorial land rights, we'd developed a framework that honored both historical ownership and modern community needs. The Morrison County Land Trust, established 6 weeks after Diane's arrest, had become a model for how traditional property rights could coexist with contemporary democratic governance. The trust operated on a simple principle: I retained legal ownership of the county's foundational land grants, but governing authority was shared with an elected council of county residents. Major development decisions required both community consensus and my approval as the historical landowner. It was a system that prevented both autocratic control and mob rule, while ensuring that future development served genuine community interests rather than external profit motives. The legal resolution of Diane's fraud had been swift and comprehensive. Federal investigators working with the state attorney general's office had uncovered a network of similar schemes, operating across 7 counties in 3 states. What had started as my battle to keep a family cabin had exposed a criminal organization that had stolen millions of dollars in property through manufactured governmental authority. Diane herself had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges that included mail fraud, wire fraud, and impersonating federal officials. The fake county officials who had provided testimony at her hearings received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. More importantly, every property transfer conducted under Diane's fraudulent authority had been legally voided. Families who had been pressured into selling their homes discovered they still owned their property. Businesses that had been forced to relocate were able to reclaim their original locations. The marina owner who had approached me during Diane's arrest had not only recovered his investment, but had been awarded damages from the criminal conspiracy's seized assets. The most satisfying restoration had been watching Meredith Thompson reclaim her voice in community affairs. The elderly neighbor who had been too frightened to support me publicly during Diane's reign of intimidation had emerged as a natural leader in the county's rebuilding process. Her experience, wisdom, and deep knowledge of local history made her an invaluable advisor as we developed new governance structures that emphasize transparency and authentic community input. "Reed," she called out from the shore, interrupting my morning contemplation. At 73, she moved with the energy of someone who had rediscovered purpose after months of feeling powerless. "The council meeting starts in an hour. Are you ready for today's discussion?" Today's county council meeting was particularly significant because we were finalizing the development guidelines that would govern Morrison County's future growth. Unlike Diane's top-down mandates disguised as community input, these guidelines had emerged from months of genuine public discussion, expert consultation, and careful consideration of both economic opportunity and environmental protection. The new community center where we held our meetings was itself a symbol of the county's transformation. Built through voluntary contributions and community labor on land I had designated for public use. It represented everything Diane's forced development had not: authentic community cooperation, respect for individual property rights, and governance based on consent rather than coercion. As I walked toward the meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my role had evolved over the past 3 months. I'd started as a man trying to defend his family's cabin, and ended up as the constitutional foundation for an entire county's legal authority. It was a responsibility I'd never sought, but one I'd grown to embrace as I witnessed the positive changes it could facilitate. The community center was already packed when I arrived, but the atmosphere was completely different from Diane's orchestrated spectacles. Instead of theatrical presentations designed to manufacture consent, today's meeting featured genuine debate, thoughtful questions, and the kind of productive disagreement that characterized healthy democratic processes. Harold Peterson, the retired county clerk whose pointed questions had first exposed the weaknesses in Diane's authority claims, now served as the elected chairman of the county council. His decades of experience in legitimate governmental procedures had proven invaluable in establishing transparent and accountable systems that prevented future fraud. "Good morning, everyone," Harold began, calling the meeting to order with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew his authority was both legitimate and accountable. "Today we're reviewing the final draft of the Morrison County Sustainable Development Guidelines, which will govern future land use decisions throughout our community." The guidelines themselves represented months of careful work by committees that included environmental scientists, economic development specialists, legal experts, and community representatives. Unlike Diane's fictional environmental assessments and manufactured economic projections, these guidelines were based on rigorous analysis conducted by professionals whose credentials could be verified and whose recommendations could be challenged through transparent public processes. The most important provision established a system of checks and balances that prevented any individual or organization from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority Diane had wielded. All development proposals required environmental impact assessments conducted by independent firms. Economic projections had to be verified by multiple sources. Community input sessions were mandatory and had to demonstrate genuine engagement rather than theatrical manipulation. The guidelines also established the Morrison County Community Protection Fund, Harold continued, which will provide legal assistance to any resident who feels pressured to surrender property rights. Thanks to the asset seizures from the criminal conspiracy, we have sufficient resources to ensure that no family in our county will ever again face the kind of intimidation tactics that were used against Reed and others. The fund represented more than just legal protection. It was a concrete commitment to preventing future abuse of power. Any county resident who faced questionable pressure to sell property or comply with dubious regulations would have access to legal representation that could challenge those demands through legitimate judicial processes. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural rather than legal. The community that had been divided by Diane's manufactured conflicts had reunited around shared values of transparency, accountability, and mutual respect. The neighbors who had turned against me during her orchestrated hearings had become some of the strongest advocates for the new governance system that protected individual rights while fostering genuine community cooperation. "We should also acknowledge," Harold said, turning to where I sat in the front row, "the extraordinary generosity Reed has shown in structuring the land trust to benefit the entire community. He could have exercised his legal ownership rights in ways that would have enriched him personally while displacing long-term residents. Instead, he's chosen to use his authority to strengthen our community's democratic institutions and economic stability." The applause that followed was genuine rather than orchestrated, warm rather than performative. These were neighbors expressing authentic gratitude rather than audiences responding to theatrical manipulation. The difference was profound and deeply moving. As the meeting progressed through the various provisions of the development guidelines, I found myself thinking about my grandfather and the generations of Garrisons who had called this place home. They had maintained their stewardship of this land through world wars, economic depressions, and social transformations that had reshaped American society beyond recognition. Now it was my turn to decide what that stewardship meant for future generations. The easy path would have been to sell development rights to legitimate companies and retire on the proceeds. The profitable path would have been to exploit my ownership position for maximum financial gain. But neither option felt consistent with the values that had guided my family's relationship with this land for over a century and a half. Instead, I'd chosen a more complex but ultimately more rewarding approach, using my legal authority to strengthen the community that shared this place, ensuring that future development served genuine local needs rather than external profit motives, and establishing safeguards that would prevent any individual or organization from accumulating the kind of destructive power Diane had wielded. "Before we conclude," Harold announced, "I'd like to invite Reed to share any final thoughts about today's guidelines and their implementation." Standing before this gathered community, I felt the weight of history and the promise of the future converging in this single moment. "3 months ago," I began, "I thought I was fighting to save my family's cabin from an overzealous HOA president. I never imagined I'd discover that my family owned an entire county, or that this cabin would become the foundation for rebuilding an entire community's relationship with democratic governance." I paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past months of community meetings, planning sessions, and shared work on county restoration projects. What we've built together over the past 3 months represents something more valuable than any development project Diane Crenshaw could have imagined. We've created a system where legitimate community needs can be addressed without sacrificing individual rights, where economic development can proceed without environmental destruction, and where governmental authority operates through consent rather than coercion. The guidelines we approved that morning established Morrison County as a model for sustainable community development that other regions were already studying and adapting. Environmental protection was balanced with economic opportunity. Individual property rights were secured within a framework of community responsibility. Leave a comment, hit like, subscribe, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, that little thanks button down below means a lot.